Correspondingly, the revolt of the slaves that threatens to dethrone the autocracy and the normative independence of strong individuals is not the revolt of the masses, but the revolt of objects. Just as, on the one hand, we have become slaves of the production process, so, on the other, we have become the slaves of the products. That is, what nature offers us by means of technology is now a mastery over the self-reliance and the spiritual center of life through endless habits, endless distractions, and endless superficial needs. Thus, the domination of the means has taken possession not only of specific ends but of the very center of ends, of the point at which all purposes converge and from which they originate as final purposes. Man has thereby become estranged from himself. An insuperable barrier of media, technical inventions, abilities and enjoyments has been erected between him and his most distinctive and essential being. There has never been an age in which such an emphasis on the intermediate aspects of life in contrast to its central and definite purposes was totally alien to that age. Rather, since man's mind is completely focused upon the categories of ends and means, it is his lasting fate to oscillate between the contradictory demands of means and ends. The means always implies the internal difficulty of using a force and awareness that are not really meant for it but for something else. However, the meaning of life does not really lie in realizing the permanent reconciliation of conditions for which it strives. In fact, the vitality of our inner life may indeed depend upon the continuation of that contradiction, and the styles of life probably differ fundamentally in terms of the intensity of this contradiction, the preponderance of the one or the other side and the psychological form of either one. In the case of the present age, in which the preponderance of technology obviously signifies a predominance of clear intelligent consciousness, as a cause as well as an effect, I have emphasized that spirituality and contemplation, stunned by the clamorous splendor of the scientific technological age, have to suffer for it by a faint sense of tension and vague longing. They feel as if the whole meaning of our existence were so remote that we are unable to locate it and are constantly in danger of moving away from rather than closer to it. Furthermore, it is as if the meaning of life clearly confronted us, as if we would be able to grasp it were it not for the fact that we lack some modest amount of courage, strength, and inner security. I believe that this secret restlessness, this helpless urgency that lies below the threshold of consciousness, that drives modern man from socialism to Nietzsche, from Böcklin to Impressionism, from Hegel to Schopenhauer and back again, not only originates in the bustle and excitement of modern life, but that, conversely, this phenomenon is frequently the expression, symptom and eruption of this innermost condition. The lack of something definite at the center of the soul impels us to search for momentary satisfaction in ever-new stimulations, sensations and external activities. Thus it is that we become entangled in the instability and helplessness that manifests itself as the tumult of the metropolis, as the mania for traveling, as the wild pursuit of competition and as the typically modern disloyalty with regard to taste, style, opinions and personal relationships. The significance of money for this kind of life follows quite logically from the premises that all the discussions in this book have identified. It is only necessary to mention here the dual role of money. Money stands in a series with all the means and tools of culture, which slide in front of the inner and final ends and ultimately cover them up and displace them. Money is most important in illustrating the senselessness and the consequences of the teleological dislocation, partly because of the passion with which it is craved for, and partly because of its own emptiness and merely transitional character. However, in this sense, money is only the highest point on the scale of all these phenomena. It carries out the function of imposing a distance between ourselves and our purposes in the same manner as other technical mediating elements, but does it more purely and completely. Here, too, money shows itself to be not an isolated instance but rather the most perfect expression of tendencies that are also discernible in a series of lower phenomena. Yet in another respect, money stands outside this whole series by frequently being the agent that brings about the transformations in the sequence of purposes. Money interweaves this sequence as the means of means, as the most general technique of practical life without which the specific techniques of our culture could not have developed. Indeed, even in this respect, money exhibits the duality of its functions through whose unification it repeats the form of the greatest and the deepest potentialities of life. On the one hand, it is an equal member or even a first among equals in the series of human existence, and, on the other, it stands above them as an integrating force that supports and permeates every single element. In the same way, religion is a force in life, one interest among others and often opposed to them. It is one of those factors that are the constituents of life. And yet, on the other hand, it expresses the unity and the basis of our whole existence. On the one hand, it is a link in life's organism, and on the other it stands opposed to that organism by expressing life through the self-sufficiency of its summit and inwardness. The rhythm or symmetry of the contents of life. I now move on to a second determinant of the style of life that is characterized, as is distancing, not by a spatial analogy but by a temporal one. Since time encompasses internal just as much as external events, so reality is characterized more directly and with less recourse to symbolism than in the former case. We are concerned here with the rhythm, in which life's contents advance and recede, with the question as to what extent different cultural epochs themselves favor or destroy the rhythm of their course, and whether money takes part in this process not only through its own movements but also through its influence on the strengthening or weakening of the periodicity of life. All the sequences of our life are regulated by upward and downward rhythm, the undulation that we immediately recognize in nature and as the basic form of so many phenomena also holds sway over the soul. The alternation of day and night which determines our whole form of life indicates rhythm as a general scheme. We are unable to pronounce two meaningfully coordinated terms without giving a greater emphasis to the one than to the other. Thus, for example, truth and poetry is something totally different from poetry and truth. And if, out of three elements, the third is coordinated to the second, it cannot be completely realized psychologically, but rather the modulating form of the psychic tends to give an accent to the third that is similar to the first. Thus, the meter cannot be expressed absolutely correctly, but rather the third syllable is inevitably somewhat more accentuated than is the second. The proportioning of sequences of activity, both large and small, into rhythmically repeated periods serves to conserve energy. By means of the change within each period, the physically or psychologically active organs are alternately spared, while at the same time the regularity of the rotation favors an adjustment to the whole complex of movements, whose regularity makes each repetition easier. Rhythm satisfies the basic needs for both diversity and regularity, for change and stability. In that each period is composed of different elements, of elevation and decline, of a quantitative or qualitative variety, the regular repetition produces a reassurance, uniformity and unity in the character of the series. Simplicity or complication of rhythm, the length or brevity of its individual periods, its regularity and its interruptions provide, as it were, the abstract scheme for individual and social, objective and historical life sequences. Within the cultural development under discussion here we first encounter a series of phenomena that takes a rhythmical course in its earlier stages but a continuous or irregular course in its later stages. Perhaps the most striking of these phenomena is that man, unlike most other animals, for whom periods of sexual excitement and indifference are distinctly separated, no longer has a definite mating period, though primitive peoples still exhibit aspects of this periodicity in their behavior. The difference in the mating period of animals is basically determined by the fact that birth has to take place during seasons that are the most favorable with regard to feeding and climatic conditions for the raising of the young. Indeed, some very primitive Australian Aborigines, who possess no domestic animals and are therefore regularly faced with famines, have children only at a definite time of the year. Through his control over food and protection against the weather, civilized man has become more independent, so that, with regard to mating, he can follow his individual rather than his general, necessarily rhythmically determined impulses. Hence the above-mentioned variations in sexuality have been transformed into a more or less fluctuating continuum. In any case, it has been established that the still observable periodicity in the maximal and minimal number of births is more marked in agricultural than in industrial areas, in the country than in cities. Furthermore, the child lives in an insurmountable rhythm of sleeping and waking, of activity and relaxation, and something similar may be observed in rural areas. Conversely, the regularity of these needs